Hello and welcome to this mini-series lecture on glucose control. We cover a few specialist topics on EIQ, including obesity, type 2 diabetes, PCOS, hypothalamic amenorrhea, cardiovascular disease, menopause, and more. And I wanted to cover this topic especially because it seems to be very timely and in the news quite a lot at the moment. With this increased concern around what you will soon find is actually quite normal and healthy glucose fluctuations. And I thought it'd be useful to cover given the popularity of things like glucose monitors at the moment. So, a bit of an overview. We're going to go over normal glucose metabolism, impaired glucose tolerance, and then touch on the use of glucose monitors, when they might be useful, when they might not be useful, if we should be using them, and what we should or shouldn't be worried about. So the first thing I want to do is explain what normal glucose metabolism is, or simply put, really what happens when you eat. So I've tried to make this in a format that people will remember. So I put in things that hopefully will trigger your memory when you're thinking about this. So when you eat food, you have a response to that consumption of food, and part of that response is an insulin response, which I have depicted here as butterflies, right? So these are released when you eat food. And then the second part of that is that insulin is then a signal, or you could frame this as like knocks on the door of cells to basically say, hey, look, there's some glucose out here in the blood. We don't want really high levels of glucose. So maybe you should open the cell or open the door so that I can bring this glucose in. And then, or in other words, right, what happens is the presence of insulin stimulates glucose transporters to the surface of the cell, which then clears blood glucose. So then what happens when the insulin is present is these glucose transporters come to the surface of the cell, open the door, let the glucose in, and then it's either used for immediate energy within that cell, or it's stored for later use. And this is completely normal. So this increase in insulin after you eat something is completely normal, and actually something that we would both expect and want to happen, right? So in examples where this doesn't happen, like type 1 diabetes, you then have to inject insulin to make sure this process does happen. So an insulin response isn't a bad thing and is completely required. And then what happens when glucose metabolism goes slightly wrong, or when you have more insulin resistance? And this basically means less sensitivity to the presence of insulin, is the same process. So you eat some food, insulin is released, you then have the insulin signaling, hey, look, there's glucose in the blood, we want to get it into the cell, please open the cell. But the cell, so this butler here is meant to be a glucose transporter. He's now got headphones in, right? So he can't really hear what's going on at the door. So they need more insulin to knock at that door to let in the same amount of glucose. So then what happens is, because people become insulin resistant, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, from chronically high levels of glucose in the blood, they need more and more insulin to then clear blood glucose, which means that you become more and more insulin resistant because of this increased chronically elevated level of both glucose and insulin. And that is one of the hallmarks of type 2 diabetes. And when you get to a place where you can no longer clear blood glucose levels and they stay chronically elevated, that would be known as either pre-diabetes or diabetes, depending on what the chronic elevation of those glucose levels are. And then the second part of this, which is quite interesting, the other thing, and this is quite important, that happens when you are insulin resistant is it's not just getting glucose into the cell, it's also your body's own production of glucose. So the reason that between meals we don't just fall into comas is that we can produce our own glucose via the liver. And what happens when you have insulin resistance is normally when you're insulin sensitive, the presence of insulin will signal to the liver, hey, let's not break down stores of either glucose or stores of glycogen or fat to create glucose. Instead, there is already a lot of glucose in the blood, so we should turn that off, right? So when people say insulin turns off fat breakdown, they're right, but it should, right? Because you wouldn't want excessive amounts of energy being broken down when there's already plenty of energy in the blood, which is signaled by, hey, look, there's insulin there, there's also glucose there. We don't need to break down the body's stored energy because there's ample energy here. Now, what happens when you have insulin resistance is the liver doesn't hear that signal to turn off our own glucose production. So not only are you struggling to clear blood glucose, but the liver's also like, I'm just going to continue to produce glucose because I can't hear that we already have a lot of energy available, so I'm going to keep breaking down energy. And that is when you get even more chronically elevated levels of glucose, and when you start to get problems like type 2 diabetes. And further to this, in cases of uncontrolled type 2 diabetes, this leads to these higher and higher requirements of insulin to try and lower glucose levels. And at some point, the cells that produce insulin in the pancreas can no longer keep up with this demand. And this is the point at which a type 2 diabetic might become dependent on insulin to manage their glucose levels. This is something we go into in far more detail in the course. I've obviously run through this quite quickly, but it's very important that people understand how this process works, and that at different stages of a healthy glucose metabolism, pre-diabetes and diabetes, and then insulin dependent diabetes, like things are slightly different, and it's important to understand how things work at each stage. The other really important thing as a personal trainer to understand is the incredible impact that exercise has on glucose clearance. So when you exercise, shockingly, something's come up being like, viewers will be able to play videos. I've put in a really great video of this door opening. Anyway, when you exercise, you stimulate muscle, which activates these glucose 4 transporters, right? So that was, remember, the butler. So when insulin knocks on the door, the butler's like, oh, the glucose transporter, the butler is like, I'm going to come to the door, I'm going to open the door, come in glucose, right? That's what happens when you exercise. And what's important about that is an insulin independent way of stimulating GLUT4. So if you're not sensitive to insulin, then actually you can still increase glucose clearance by stimulating muscle. So that's really important, and is especially obviously important for diabetics, but really important for like any healthy metabolism. So you get this upregulation of GLUT4, which means that you can clear glucose from the blood. So again, that GLUT4 goes over to the cell membrane, opens the door, welcomes in the glucose, and then that can be stored as glycogen, or if you're exercising, it might be used for energy straight away. And this is one of the reasons that things as simple as just walking after eating large meals are so useful to clear blood glucose, especially if you have impaired glucose tolerance or insulin sensitivity or insulin resistance, reduced insulin sensitivity or insulin resistance, because it's this insulin independent way of clearing blood glucose. And then the other cool thing is that exercise induced increases in insulin sensitivity also stay upregulated for about 3 days after exercise. So I always say, like, to optimize this increase in insulin sensitivity, you should work out at least every 3 days to try and keep this extra sensitivity up. And now I'm going to move on to glucose monitors. So I am sure people have seen more people wearing these. Now, unless an alarming number of people have suddenly developed type 1 diabetes, it's normally because they're often very healthy people that have no need to be monitoring their glucose levels day to day. But the theory behind this is quite a simplistic one, and that is that glucose spikes are inherently bad and lead to weight gain. And a lot of diets at the moment are pushing this narrative. We'll call that diet Joey, and you'll probably know what I'm talking about. But anyway, the evidence at the moment doesn't support this. It shows that you can lose fat on a high carb diet, on a low carb diet, and you can lose fat. So when calories are matched, there is no evidence to support that glucose spikes or avoiding glucose spikes would aid or impact weight loss. So people lose weight on diets like the Joey diet because they are in a calorie deficit, not because they're monitoring their glucose levels and adapting their diet to suit. What might happen, and what probably does happen, is that if you monitor your glucose levels, given that when you eat the vast majority of food, your glucose will increase. If you're trying to avoid that, you will end up eating a significant amount less calories. I'm going to go on to say why that's probably a stupid way to monitor how quote unquote good your diet is, or to base your diet around simply glucose readings. And if you do, you will do stupid things like avoid eating fruit, or, as has been kind of portrayed a fair bit by some popular people on Instagram recently, adding a lot of fat to carb intake so that it will reduce your glucose spike, but then you've added a ton of calories to it, right? So things like adding fat to your meals to reduce the glucose spikes that are completely normal, and avoiding them makes very little sense, especially if you don't want to ram a load of fat into your diet, which may actually have its own negative consequences, but will certainly make it much harder for you to stick to your calories, especially if you're avoiding things like fruit intake. So other potential problems with this is a really unhealthy obsession. So we speak a fair amount on EIQ about dieting being a positive thing and the negative impacts that some people have when they diet and how to avoid those. So really, like, what we hope coaches will be able to do after doing EIQ, in fact what we know coaches are able to do, is to diet their clients in a way where they get results without having the negative impacts of dieting. And one of those negative impacts is like this unhealthy obsession with diet and exactly what you're eating, and overly tracking calories, or being afraid to eat out, or being afraid to eat carbs, and this like fear around food. And I think that glucose monitors are only going to perpetuate that for a lot of people. The second thing is the mass misinterpretation of data, right? It's way too simplistic to think glucose spikes are bad, we should avoid them. There is no evidence to back that up, nor does that make any sense whatsoever. And we know that different people respond in different ways to even the same foods, but that doesn't mean that those foods don't still contain like really healthy nutrients that you might want to include in your diet. Then the thing I just spoke about, which is to increase your fat intake in order to reduce these glucose spikes, because the fat intake slows gastric emptying. That obviously will add a lot of calories and will often just mean that you're making what might be quite a healthy choice slightly less healthy by chucking a load of fat onto it. And again, that's not saying that fat is bad, but in excess, it's certainly not a good thing. Things like it impacting really good food choices, like reducing your fruit intake because you're worried about glucose spikes. And then really, one of the things I'm most passionate about is making diet and exercise both accessible to everyone. So one, these things cost a lot of money and are completely unnecessary. But two, they overcomplicate the process a lot. And kind of back to my point about misinterpreting data, a lot of people don't know how to read glucose monitors. And actually, a really good point made by Dr. Nicola Guess, who is a diabetes researcher, we don't actually have much data on what normal glucose responses are, like normal healthy glucose responses are, because most of the research is done in type 2 diabetics, because it actually doesn't really matter what the glucose response is in a normal healthy person, because there's no negative consequences of that. So when you're looking at this data and you're like, well, is that a high glucose response? Is that a low glucose response? We don't actually have really enough data to show that. So it is massively overcomplicating things for people. And if you're not diabetic or pre-diabetic, then your body is very efficient at handling glucose loads and then producing insulin in order to clear those glucose loads. And that is a completely normal, healthy thing to be happening within your body and not something we should be overthinking or avoiding. And I'm worried it's going to turn into essentially another arm of orthorexia, which is probably even more in, like anal and analytical than calorie tracking. So to conclude, do you need to monitor your glucose? Should you be actively avoiding glucose spikes? In short, the answer is no. And I will be interested to see the data that comes out in years to come when we have more research on this. And hey, I am always open to being wrong, but at the moment, it's certainly not something I would suggest that anybody does. I think if we also just look at like a more rational overview of this, like, have people been living healthily and losing fat without anally monitoring their glucose levels consistently all the time for many, many years? Yes, so we probably don't need to be doing it now. The other interesting thing to note is that most people who are obsessing over this are, or most people I've seen with glucose monitors are like already very health conscious and are probably the last people that need to be worrying about what their glucose levels are doing throughout the day. Okay, so a little overview of what we've gone over. Hopefully you now understand normal glucose metabolism and how that works. Hopefully you now understand what happens in impaired glucose metabolism and why there's this need for increased insulin. And really, I think this is really the crux to get across is it is completely normal and healthy to have spikes in glucose and spikes in insulin, especially when you eat. What is not healthy and what is the hallmark of type 2 diabetes is elevated levels, chronically elevated levels of both insulin and glucose. That's when you start to get problems. So hopefully you now understand impaired glucose tolerance and then when you may or may not want to use glucose monitors. So thank you very much for your time and attention. As I said a couple of times in this is something I've whizzed over here. It's something we go into in a lot more depth in EIQ, and if you want to join, you can head over to eiqnutrition.com. If you have any questions, shoot an email. That is meant to say info@eiqnutrition.com, or you can message the Instagram EIQ_nutrition. Thanks!